صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Allah. Brothers and sisters, we'll be starting the evening with some verses from the Quran. Can we please welcome Fatima Manji with Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض ولقد وصينا الذين أوتوا الكتاب من قبلكم وإياكم أن اتقوا الله وإن تكفروا فإن لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكان الله غنيا حميدا. ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكفى بالله وكيلا. إن يشأ يذهبكم أيها الناس ويأت بآخرين وكان الله على ذلك قديرا. من كان يريد ثواب الدنيا فعند الله ثواب الدنيا والآخرة وكان الله سميعا بصيرا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله والكتاب الذي نزل على رسوله والكتاب الذي أنزل من قبل ومن يكفر بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
We're very fortunate today to be joined by Andrew Feinstein to be talking about apartheid then and now, South Africa, Israel and the ICJ. Please welcome him with a loud round of applause. Andrew was an ANC Member of Parliament in South Africa for over 7 years, where he served under Nelson Mandela. He served on the Finance and Public Accounts Committees and as Deputy Chair of the country's Audit Commission. He also served as Economic Advisor to Gauteng Premier, Tokyo Sexwale. Please give him another round of applause.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. It's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry to keep you waiting. It's not a South African thing. I must have driven past here 5 times without realizing. This might be the biggest porter cabin I've ever seen. But if this is what is... Can I just ask, can everybody hear me at the back if I don't use a microphone? Is that okay? Oh, you're streaming. Oh, so you need it. Okay, then let me put it on. No, that's fine. The reason I hate sitting down should be great. The reason that I'm not sitting behind the table and that I hate using microphones is very soon after I was elected to Parliament in South Africa, after our first democratic elections, I was sent on a delegation to the United States of America, the first time that anybody from a democratically elected South African government had officially gone to America. And we went to Atlanta first, symbolically, because it was the home of Martin Luther King Jr. We arrived at the airport, and my boss, Tokyo Sexwale, who was the premier of our Gauteng province, gets off the plane with me. We get welcomed by the mayor of Atlanta, who was a former professional basketball player. So to someone of my height, he seemed to be about 8'10". Atlanta is home to CNN and to the Coca-Cola Corporation. And the mayor welcomed us from behind what looked like a illuminated Coke can. So after he'd said a few words, Tokyo, my boss, says to me, "Andrew, you go and respond. I'm too tired after this trip." So I walked up the stairs to what I thought was the top of this lectern, and I said a few words. And I didn't really know Tokyo that well. So I went down again, and I said to him, "Chief, was that okay?" And he said, "What you said was fine. It's just a shame that all we could see sticking out of the top of the illuminated Coke can was a very sweaty, bald head." So I've always had an aversion to talking behind things or using microphones, so forgive me that I'm going to walk around a bit as I talk. So, as you heard, I'm South African. As you can see, I'm what, under the system of apartheid, which meant separateness, I was classified as a white person. My children, who are of mixed race, they're Jewish and Muslim because I'm married to a Bangladeshi woman. Whenever I tell them that under apartheid I was classified as white, which gave me many privileges, they look at me and they say, "But you're not white, you're pink." And I say, "Yeah, well, you know, it's called white supremacy. What can I say?" So I was very lucky that I was born with this skin. I had an extremely good education. I lived very comfortably. And it was almost impossible to get into trouble with the law as a white South African. We comprised just over 10% of the entire population of the country. So almost 90% of the country were not white or pink. In apartheid terms, and I'm sorry to have to use this language, they were either classified as black African or as colored, people of mixed race. And everything you did was determined by what color you were, what area you could live in, who you could marry, what beaches you could go to, what bench you could sit on, what jobs you could do. Every single thing you could think about in your life was predetermined by your race. So I lived in the best part of Cape Town. So-called colored people lived in the next area out. And then black Africans lived furthest out. And we were not supposed to mix except when people of color had to come and work in the white areas, because we were much too important to do domestic work, to look after gardens, and any of the menial tasks. To give you an indication of just how completely insane this was, my wife of over 30 years, if she had come to South Africa, not only wouldn't we have been allowed to have a relationship, not only wouldn't we have been allowed to live in the same area together, we would not even have been allowed to drive alone in a car together. This was the basis of our society. And we were told that what this system of apartheid was doing was ensuring the survival of white, Christian, democratic values. I was fortunate in another way, though. My father, who was a Jewish South African, married my mother, who was Austrian. They met here in London, just after the Second World War. So my mother grew up in a city called Vienna, very beautiful city. Her mother was Jewish, so she was Jewish. Her father was Catholic. In 1938, Nazi Germany occupied Austria, where Adolf Hitler was actually born, and it became part of the German Reich. My mother was 9 years old. She had been at school for 2 years. First, they put the Jews into a Jewish-only school. Then they decided Jews didn't need to be educated, so they closed down that school. So my mother, who was one of the cleverest people I'd ever met, had 2.5 years of formal education. The Nazis then started to collect all of the Jews in Vienna and take them to concentration camps, where 6 million Jews were murdered, simply because they were Jewish. In addition to that, 6 million other people were murdered because they were either socialists or communists, because they were people with some form of physical or mental impairment, or because they were Roma people. These people were all seen as impure by the Nazis. My mother was one of very few Jews to survive the Second World War in Vienna itself, and she survived by being hidden in a coal cellar. And whenever Nazi soldiers were nearby, she would be rolled up into a carpet, and that carpet would be put up against the wall. And coal would be stacked around the carpet, just in case the soldiers managed to get into the cellar, in the hope that they wouldn't see there was a carpet there. And my mother would tell me about how terrifying it was for a 9, 10, 11-year-old girl. She couldn't see anything. It was obviously dark. She could barely breathe because of the coal dust. All she could hear was soldiers trying to bash down the door. And on one occasion, they actually shot bullets into the door to try and shoot the lock away so that they could get in. She survived like that for 3.5 years with her mother. Dozens of her family were not so lucky. They were rounded up, put on trains like cattle, taken mainly to Auschwitz, which was in Poland, and they were gassed to death. Some of her family who survived these camps, including a cousin, came out of the camps thinking that their entire family were dead. So they made their way to Palestine. And there my mother's cousin found that her father had actually survived, and he too had made his way to Palestine. because of the Holocaust, Jews who had a particular political ideology called Zionism, who believed that there should be created a nation state, especially for Jewish people, were given the right, in terms of something called the Balfour Declaration, to create this state in Palestine. The difficulty was that just like when white people, or what my daughter thinks are pink people, arrived on the southern tip of Africa in South Africa, they claimed there were no people there. But interestingly, they had to fight many wars. So I always wondered how they had fought wars if there were no people there. Were they fighting amongst each other? Because there were many millions of people there, just like there were in Palestine. So that the racist apartheid state of South Africa was built on the bodies and on the murder of many, many indigenous people in South Africa. Just as the state of Israel was created only as a consequence of the expulsion of millions of Palestinians from their land, on the bodies of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And we can never forget this, that with the birth of Israel came the Nakba, the great tragedy. My mother and my father took us to Israel and took us to Yad Vashem, the memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. But when we were back in South Africa, my mother often wouldn't be at home for breakfast. And one day I said to her, "Mom, why do you often go out so early in the morning? What do you do?" She said, "Well, you know, after so many Jews were killed, simply because they were Jewish, we said, never again. Never again should any people have to suffer what we have suffered." She said, in this country, the majority of people who are called black are being treated in the same way that we, the Jews, were treated under the Nazis. And so I go out every morning with other women, and we stand at busy intersections, and we hold up placards talking about the evils of apartheid, because never again means never again for any human being. And that was really, really important to me. And my mother and the other white women would not be arrested because they were white. And that's what I grew up with. So when I was a bit older, and I could go to Israel on my own, and I could go to the occupied Palestinian territories, and I heard the story of the Nakba, and I heard about the brutal and illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, immediately what I thought of what my mother had told me. Never again. And surely it was historically ironic, historically tragic, that the people committing atrocities against the Palestinian people were Jews, who themselves had suffered the ultimate abuse by the Nazis. And then I discovered that Israel, an apartheid state, as my former boss Nelson Mandela described it, and my friend Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, in fact, Israel is a more brutal system of apartheid than South Africa ever was. Because in South Africa, the apartheid state needed the cheap black labor to run the economy, to work in the mines, to mine the gold, the diamonds, the uranium that our country has in such plenitude. Whereas in Israel, the economy doesn't need the Palestinian people. And therefore, Israel behaves towards the Palestinians in even more brutal and worse ways than our apartheid rulers, who, by the way, were Nazis. Many of them were jailed in South Africa during the Second World War because they were Nazis. And these people were embraced by Israel because they were also a racist apartheid country. So when we ask ourselves, why was it South Africa that took Israel to the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, the court that only adjudicates on one crime, the crime of crimes, genocide, on the basis of laws, a genocide convention that was created to ensure that never again was made a reality. South Africa took that decision at cost to itself because we overcame a racist apartheid system. Because we know what it is like to live under an apartheid system and to defeat it. And because we believe we have a responsibility in the world to ensure that what happened in South Africa never happens anywhere else. In addition to which, because of that history, the South African struggle for liberation from apartheid, of which, as a privileged white South African, I was so fortunate to be able to play a part. Because of that, my organization, the African National Congress, of which Nelson Mandela was the leader, saw the Palestinian struggle as a fraternal struggle. It was the same struggle. It was a struggle against imperialism, and it was a struggle against what we call settler colonialism, where people arrived on a land and said, this is empty land and we need land. Whereas in fact, the land was populated by people who had lived there for generations and generations and generations. So we understand the plight of the Palestinian people. And I cannot tell you the pride that I felt seeing the South African legal team, who under apartheid would have been described as an Asian colored woman, a black African man, and fortunately, an older white man as well. So I felt a bit represented. But what did those people represent standing before the highest court in the world? They represented the fact that the oppressed people of South Africa had now become the lawyers and the judges of our society. And so their brilliant legal argument, in which they dissected what is happening in Gaza and made clear to the court that this is a crime of apartheid, that it is war crimes, that it is the crime of genocide, was unanswerable. And when the Israeli lawyers, who you might have noticed, all looked like me, they were all what my daughter would describe as pink, tried to answer, they had no defense. The fact that they also couldn't keep their pages in order is an additional factor that was somewhat embarrassing. Because what they're doing in Gaza is completely indefensible. But what is worse is that our governments in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Germany, in France, in Italy, are not just allowing them to slaughter tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians, but providing the weapons that are being used for the slaughter. Do you know that every day an RAF plane leaves from an RAF base in Cyprus for Israel, and the government won't tell us what is on that plane? Now, I've been investigating the global weapons business for 23 years now. And whenever a government won't tell you what is on a plane going into a conflict zone, you can be 99.9% sure that what is on that plane is weapons and bombs and missiles. So that when 247 Palestinian people are killed today, 48 of them women, 117 of them children, tomorrow Israel will have more bombs and more missiles to kill another 247 Palestinian people. So we are directly complicit in the slaughter of Palestinians. And that is why even a court that is headed by an American judge had no choice but to say that there is a plausible risk that Israel is committing genocide on the Palestinian people. And what does that mean when we take this nice legal term, plausible risk? It means that it is highly likely that Israel is committing genocide. So for us ordinary people who can't speak in this legal language, it means Israel is committing genocide. But it's going to take the court 3 or 4 years to make all of those legal arguments. Instead, what it has said is, as of today, in order to ensure that the possibility of genocide stops now, we order Israel to stop killing Palestinian people, to stop verbally inciting people to genocide. And who did they quote as the people who've been inciting genocide against Palestine? The President of Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, the head of the Israeli military. And they told them to stop. The importance of this decision is illustrated by the fact that the day before the court gave its ruling, and anybody who has 2 brain cells to run together knew that the court had no choice but to find that genocide was being committed. Because the day before, the United States of America, which provides Israel with 70% of all of its weapons, approved another huge arms deal with Israel. Why did it do it the day before the ruling? Because even Joe Biden, who on television seems barely alive, knows that the day after the ruling, the possibility of legal cases against himself personally and his government for complicity in genocide is far more likely. And thank goodness that is what is happening. There are court cases in the United States of America. There are court cases being prepared in this country. There are court cases being prepared in Spain against the governments that are providing the weapons that are ensuring that Palestinians continue to be slaughtered in cold blood. What has Israel's response to this ruling been? Now, you don't need to look under the carpets. You don't need to read between the lines when it comes to understanding what Israel is doing. All you need to do is listen to the most senior political and military leaders in Israel. Because they told us, even before the court made its ruling, that it didn't matter what the court ruled because they were going to ignore it. And what have they done since the court has ruled? They have ignored it. As we sit here today, over 1,000 Palestinians have been slaughtered since the court made its ruling. And yesterday, the South African Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, invoked the International Court of Justice to act against Israel, which within 2 hours of the court ruling had already violated those rulings. So what we are dealing with here is a criminal, rogue, racist state. But it is a state that is being supported and enabled by our countries. And let me tell you something else. Many people here in the United States of America, in Italy, in France, in Germany, are making billions of dollars out of enabling and facilitating the genocide that is being conducted in Gaza. And it includes the people who we have elected to our parliament. And if you don't believe me, let me tell you that a gentleman you might recall called Tony Blair, who told us that God told him and his mate George W. Bush to invade Iraq, since leaving office has made, and this is a very conservative estimate that I made quite a few years ago now, has personally made at least 110 million pounds directly from companies that benefited from the invasion of Iraq and sold the weapons that were used in that invasion and around the world. Because that is what our politics have become. We have become nothing better than war profiteers. And unfortunately, the reality is it no longer seems to matter which political party you belong to in this country. My own MP is the leader of the Labour Party, a party that on the membership card says is a democratic socialist party. Now, I have a little bit of experience of an actual democracy. Nothing about the Labour Party is what I understand to be democratic. And I won't even go into the socialism bit. This is a man whose first career was as a human rights lawyer. A lawyer who argues cases to protect people's human rights. What is the most important human right of all? The right to life. After becoming leader of the Labour Party, the first thing that Keir Starmer uttered, I am an unqualified and uncritical Zionist. What has Keir Starmer said since the ICJ ruling on Gaza? Not one word. How contemptible, how inhumane is it possible for a person to be? When you see the videos and the photographs that we see every day, and he won't call for a ceasefire, he won't comment on the fact that Israel has been accused of genocide by the highest court in the world, and he will not even comment on that court ruling. So what do we do? Because the bottom line is each of us, whether we are Muslims, whether we are Jews, whether we are Christians, whether we are Hindus, whether we are Buddhists, whether we are Sikh, whether we are people of no faith, every single one of us who has an ounce of humanity has a responsibility to do what we can to stop the constant slaughter of innocent Palestinians. So first of all, we've got to continue demonstrating. We've got to continue protesting. Because the ICJ ruling places a lot more pressure on our government. Because every time they agree to send another bullet or another spare part for the planes that are dropping the bombs, let alone the actual bombs and missiles themselves, to Israel, they become more and more complicit in that genocide. And we have to remind them of that. A minimum of 76% of people in this country have wanted a ceasefire since the 12th of October. And our political leaders have ignored that. They have placed their loyalty to Israel and their desire to make money out of the weapons being sold to Israel ahead of the overwhelming desire of the vast majority of British people. So we have to keep that pressure on them all the time. The second thing we have to do is we have to demand that they halt all arms sales to Israel. In so doing, they are violating our own laws in the United Kingdom. We have an Arms Export Control Act that says, even if you are not a lawyer, it says very clearly, you cannot send a weapon into a conflict area if by selling that weapon you might make it more likely that civilians will die in that conflict. Well, there has never been a clearer case in the almost 60 years that I've been on this earth than what is happening in Gaza at the moment. So we have to demand of our political leaders to stop all arms sales to Israel. And then, when there is any form of election, we have to make it clear that we will not vote for any politician at a local level, at a regional level, or at a national level who has not supported a ceasefire. And not tomorrow or next week, because we've had months of Palestinians being murdered. And every day that our politicians have refused to call for a ceasefire has resulted in another 247 people being slaughtered. It doesn't matter what party those people represent. It doesn't matter what religion they are. It doesn't matter whether you see them every day in your mosque, in your shops, or in your restaurants. If they have not supported the Palestinian people by demanding a ceasefire and demanding that Britain stops its arms exports to Israel, they do not deserve our vote. And if there is nobody who is up for election, be it in local elections, which are going to be held in May, be it in national elections, which have to be held before the end of the year, then your community must get together and put up a candidate who has shown their commitment to the Palestinian people and who want peace for the Palestinian people. And now I'm going to be a little bit naughty. And I'm going to say that there is actually someone amongst us who hasn't announced that they're going to run, but has run as an independent candidate here before. And that's Pamela Fitzpatrick. Because unless we do this, not only will the current slaughter continue, but Israel will be allowed to continue its illegal and brutal occupation of Palestine and continue to be an apartheid state. And I, as a white South African, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, cannot believe that we still have apartheid in this world in the year 2024. So I beseech you, and I ask you to do everything you can. Because every morning when we wake up and see the faces and the names of those who have been killed the day before, that takes away a little bit of our souls, a little bit of our hearts too. And finally, I want to say something because it's especially important to say it to this community. I did nothing in my life that warranted having the privilege to serve under someone like Nelson Mandela. I did nothing that warranted having a friend and a political mentor like Desmond Tutu. But because I had that privilege, I have a responsibility. A responsibility to what they taught me is anti-racism. So when somebody suggests that somebody else is lesser than them, that their life is worth less than theirs, I will tell them what they are. They are a racist. And it was racism that led to the Holocaust, in which my mother's family died. It was racism that led to apartheid in South Africa. And it is racism that is allowing what is going on in Gaza to continue to happen. And I will not tolerate any form of racism, of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia, of anti-black racism, or any other form of discrimination. But at the same time, I will not sit quietly while somebody, usually a non-Jewish person like Keir Starmer, tells me that because I believe the Israeli state is racist, I am a self-hating Jew. My children would argue that my problem is exactly the opposite of self-hating. I also studied clinical psychology for 6 years while I was trying to stay out of the apartheid army. And if there's one thing I detest, not quite as much as racism, but close to it, it is this use of nonsense pop psychology to try and suggest that someone who has a different opinion to you has some sort of psychological ailment. And I will not let Keir Starmer and his Labour Party, with their hierarchy of racism, suggest to me that I am an anti-Semite. Because to be an anti-Semite means you hate Jews because they are Jews. And I don't criticize the state of Israel because the majority of Israelis are Jews. I criticize the state of Israel because it is a racist, violent apartheid state. And we must not allow ourselves to be silenced by the abuse and weaponization of anti-Semitism in order to protect the state of Israel. And so, my final words, please, remember what my former boss Nelson Mandela said. First, he said, the question of Palestine is the most important issue of our age. And then, when he was released after 27 years in prison, he didn't come out and say, let's have a party because I'm free. Instead, he said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those powerful words. We now have some time for some questions. If anyone has any questions, please put your hand up. Okay, so we start here.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. Just a question for you, please. Can you tell us a bit more about the context of South Africa as a country taking that decision to go to the ICJ? It's just, for somebody like myself, and I think many of us, we don't really understand what's in it for them. You know, what are they going to win and what are they going to lose? Just, if you can tell us a bit more about how and why they made that decision.
I would love to be able to tell you that it was all just a decision of principle. But the world doesn't work like that, sadly. And my own country, South Africa, faces huge challenges as a democracy. And we've only been a democracy for 30 years, just under. Palestine is an incredibly important issue in South African politics generally. One of the first foreign leaders to address our democratic parliament was Yasser Arafat. And as I said earlier, our struggles have always been fraternal because there are so many similarities between the struggles. In addition to which, as I mentioned,